Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about shit that I don't know shit about. Sort of, right? If you're new here, welcome. I'm Raf. I talk mostly about books and sometimes other things, mostly when I'm angry, not always. And today I want to talk about a big question, and that is, what is fantasy and who the fuck wants to know? Reason is that a critical dragon, AP Canavan, made a video on Portal Fantasy and attempts to define the genre. And then Dr. Philip Chase made a response video. I'll link both down below. And me, in my eternal quest, a quest that is doomed to fail, of course, to be taken seriously by other people, decided to barge in with my opinion that probably no one cares about. So, let's look at all of that, shall we? Well, cheers. All right, so both of those videos are, wrestle with the question of like, what is fantasy as a genre for literature, I guess, mostly, although we probably can extend it to movies and stuff as well. And my first question here is, and I'll give my attempt at like defining it in a bit, but my first question that I wanted to ask there is like, why do we try to focus on definitions? And there's a bunch of reasons why we want to do that. And I think there's like three that I want to look at here. One is the academic, two is the economical, and three is the personal category. So let's talk about the academic first, because we're trying to pretend to be, smart people here from time to time, right? So, academic. In academia, especially in the humanities, although not only there, I mean, of course, with mathematics and stuff being sort of like where that whole shit starts, we try to define the subject of things that we talk about. It's just like how you do these things, because otherwise communication doesn't work. It's like, I say, we want to talk about this subject, and I define this subject as, and then I give like a bunch of definitions according to whatever system I'm using. And then I try to make my points about that subject that I want to talk about. That's just like how academia works. Now, if we assume that fantasy literature has become a subject of academic study, and it has, apparently, then we need to do that as well, because we need to define the field. We need to both make sure that we can communicate about what we're talking about, and have meaningful communication, and on the other hand, we need to do some demarcation to make sure those pesky people from the literary fiction don't intrude on our place and tell us which bits of fantasy are magical realism and thus worthy of study and reading, and which are fantasy and thus trash. Yes, I'm talking about Salman Rushdie here. I have not forgiven you, my man. Anyway, so here's the point. That's why we need to, or feel the need to define fantasy. It's like, if we're talking about fantasy fiction, we need to give a definition if we want to, have a meaningful communication about it in academic circles, I guess. That's all well and good. And I guess we'll look at a further thing from all of that in at the end of the whole thing. Point two, the economic. This is the cynical one. We need genre definitions if we're trying to sell stuff, because there's a shitload of stuff out there in books, of everything. That's just, how capitalism works at this point. There's a shitload of books out there, and if I want to sell books to a target audience, I need to put a label on it. So, the poor underpaid workers in your bookstore know where to put your book, and the hurried mom trying to find a book for their kid knows to which section of the bookstore to go and grab the first thing that is on display there. That's how that works. So there is, within the publishing industry and all the stuff that runs around it, like bookstores, all of that stuff, there is obviously a need or a wish for categorization or labeling. Now, there's something that is very interesting that we'll look at in a second as well, and that is how the digital market has changed that, because now we can tag things. All right, but the point is that there is a need for that, which is when a publisher finds themselves with a specific book a specific text, they will look at like which is probably the best target audience to what kind of people can we sell this? Can we sell this more to people that love, Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter? Are we looking for a more like maybe younger audience? There's a lot of cynicism going into all of that. It's like where can we sell this best? And that's the genre that it will be in, because that's why we decide whether we put like a Salman Rushdie book into the fantasy genre or in the literature shelf at our bookstore. Because at the end of the day, it's a decision by the marketing department and where they think they might sell more books. Now we come to the third one, and that is the personal category. And that is that we, as people, define ourselves by the stuff we like and the stuff we dislike. So when I go out and tell you that I love reading fantasy, I'm making a statement. If I go out and tell you that I love reading magical realism or speculative fiction, and not sci-fi, I'm also making a statement. In one case, I'm like, I'm a nerd. In the other one, I'm like, I'm a serious person and I'm trying to be, to appear intellectual. Those are different aspects of the same thing. And it's very much about that. So how an individual person defines fantasy will often depend on, like, fantasy is the stuff that I like. If, I want to, be seen as a person who loves fantasy, sees themselves as part of that larger fandom nerd culture kind of thing that we have, then I'll say fantasy is the stuff that I like. If, on the other hand, I'm Salman Rushdie and I want to be seen as someone who creates meaningful art and serious literature, I will categorize all the books that I like into magical realism, or maybe fantastic fiction, or fiction with fantastic elements, and all the stuff that I personally don't like, or think that will be detrimental to my image that I'm building up here, I will categorize all of that as fantasy and then call it trash. And, not to put too much weight on the Salman Rushdie case from last year, it's something that we all do. And where do I know this from? Well, from my time in the heavy metal scene, where this is extremely big of a thing. It's a very, splintered scene. We see the same with fantasy. I'm coming back to that in a second. Don't worry. Where we're like, are you listening to heavy metal? It's like, no, I listen to this specific stuff, and this is heavy metal, and everything else is not heavy metal. Like Sabaton is not heavy metal. Sabaton is proto-fascist guitar pop, and not heavy metal. My case, my definition, where we categorize into like stuff that belongs, that I like and that makes me look good. That's, under that label, and the rest is in another label. And we all tend to do this. Same with fantasy when we come to the sub-labels. And this is something that I guess comes back to what we've seen with tags and stuff. And this is suddenly we figure out that it's very, very difficult to give a definitive, definition of something. What is fantasy? You watch a Critical Dragons video, you'll see him struggling with it. It talks about fuzzy sets, which is, something that I've known from computer science, but apparently it has made its way into the humanities, where they try to pretend they're doing science because that might just give them a little more funding, so they're not completely scraping the bottom of the barrel where finances are, concerned. Anyway, point is, and then you look at Dr. Philip Chase's video, and he gives a bunch of things and elements that he thinks define fantasy, or like a subset of those is always present in fantasy, I guess. And you realize it's basically impossible to define fantasy as that kind of thing. You can go back to your like old Aristotelian model of like finding like the family and the specific and the differences and whatnot. It doesn't work with fantasy as a whole because it's a too, fuzzy kind of thing. And art is notoriously bad, difficult to circumscribe, I guess. So we come up with wonderful things. When we come to the marketing category, when we come to the academic category, we go at, fuzzy sets and stuff like that, like the Critical Dragon did. When we come to the marketing bit, Computer science has given us the internet, and suddenly we realize we can sort things under several categories. And we do that with tags, or whatever you want to call it, labels or tags or whatever. And you look at like Amazon or anyone else, suddenly your fantasy book will also be listed under horror, if it's like a bit darker, or under literary fiction, or under romance, or all these other things, because that will help to define, like, or categorize that book. And it will make it possible to market the same thing to two people, because it's now both in the romance shelf and in the fantasy shelf. So more people can go and suffer through Twilight. Wonderful, isn't it? Yes. And that obviously goes the same way for like the personal side of things, where we then start to talk about subgenres. Subgenres are basically when we try to make something even more clear who we are and exclude more bits and be more gatekeepy, sort of. Or in academic terms, when we want to talk about a very specific subset of pieces of art. So yeah, suddenly we don't only have fantasy, we have urban fantasy, we have epic fantasy, we have grimdark fantasy, we have supernatural romance, we have, I have no idea what else. There was like an attempt to have like a counter thing to grimdark, which was called Noblebright. Don't even look at it, it's horrible. We have Christian fantasy, we have portal fantasy, we have like all these subgenres, and some of them are more about like, trying to describe what something is in like an academic way, and the other side is more about, demarcation and making clear what exactly we like about fantasy and what not. It's like if we're like an edgy person, we say we want to talk about grimdark fantasy, and your Lord of the Rings is just like old and started, it doesn't have any connection to the real world, and the existential horror or suffering through all of this. It's bullshit, but you know what I mean. Suddenly we have all these subgenres, which are then subject to the same thing, and we can go and try to define, urban fantasy. And we've seen what A Critical Dragon does with that, and how difficult defining that is again. It's like, it goes down and down and down and down. And at the end of the day, when we try to define something, we need to look at why are we trying to define it. Are we trying to define it to make sure that everyone knows what kind of person we are? Are we trying to define it in order to have a conversation about a specific thing that we need to talk about? And that may also impact our definition. It's like if I want to talk about the use of magic, then my definition of fantasy literature might include all the books that include magic, because I need to focus on that specific aspect. And, maps, like the very Tolkien-influenced Dr. Philip Chase mentioned, are irrelevant when we talk about magic. If it's, however, on like a different subject, then we might shift or like look at a different form of definition there. So it really depends on what we try to achieve with our definition. What are we trying to do? If we want to market it, then yeah, finding broad categories to appeal to as many people as possible might just be the way to go. It really depends on that. And then the final thing is like, where do we come from? Where do we go as individuals? And like, what's our personal interest? Because that will also color it. Case in point, A Critical Dragon, A.P. Canavan, is focusing on narrative. So when he tries to explain or give a definition or a working definition of fantasy, what he does is he focuses on the narrative elements, the portal thing, going out into the world, and looking at the thing like from Joseph Campbell and all these other things. He focuses on the narrative as how to look at fantasy, because that's what he's interested in. Philip Chase, however, goes and is like, I'll just list a bunch of things so we can connect over those, and people who like books with those elements will probably like fantasy that I like. Well, that he likes, I guess, which, with him being something of a Tolkien fan, includes both language, which is a Tolkien thing, and maps, which kind of start with well, of course you can find previous, but Tolkien is very much about maps and language, because that's stuff that Tolkien really liked, drawing maps and inventing languages. So those things crop up there. Now, if I would go and try to define fantasy, which I'm trying to do now, I would focus on like other things again. Because I, pretended to study philosophy for a while. I'm still pretending. But, so I would have that sort of approach. And I looked at it and I thought, like, how do we define fantasy? And then I looked at let's look at it being just like fiction. What specific form of fiction is it? Because, that's like that Aristotelian approach, like what category, and then we go and try to find things that separate it from other forms of literature or fiction. So what kind of fiction is it? Now, one of the most interesting authors of the last century, Gene Wolfe, said fantasy, every fiction is fantasy. It's just fantasy books are more honest about it. That's not where we want to go with this. I want to look at like what does fiction do, what makes fiction interesting, and then look at like what fantasy fiction does compared to other sorts of fiction. And my personal approach, and I might go back to that in a different video at some point, is that fiction in general tries to bring us an insight into the human condition and what it means to be human, what it means to be human in general, and also what it means to be a human in a very specific situation, through giving us the chance to empathize with specific characters that go through specific things. That's what all form of fiction does. It creates fictional characters that we identify with in a certain way, and then may learn something about how it could be to be that specific person. That's what fiction does. I think that's a very good definition of what fiction does, by telling us what we get out of fiction apart from entertainment. So fiction is a way to answer specific questions or look at specific aspects of the human condition, and explore those possibilities. Now, what makes fantasy very different from, say, science fiction or literary fiction? And I looked at that and it's like, what? Literary fiction is giving us answers, or not answers, like tries to look at things that could happen, that are, that could happen right now somewhere. Historical fiction is something that I would probably add into that category, because historical fiction oftentimes answers the question like how it might have been to be a person in that or that specific part of human history. It is very much tied to the back then and all the way up to the now. That's what literary fiction does, like sort of, in my working definition right now. Now, science fiction, on the other hand, goes and it's like, what? Let's look at how it could be to be human in an alternative that is possible, that is theoretically possible, and that can be far future. Now, we tend to often look like science fiction is all about technology, and also about the future, because if we're just writing about today, then it feels sort of like, what's the science fiction part about it? But that's neither here nor there, because we're not talking about like science fiction today, really. So science fiction explores possibilities that could be. Things that how it could be to be human in situations that could be, or where we could end up as humanity, or could have ended up in, which is why you could also have your alternate history stuff in there, right? It's like, how would it be to be human in Alaska, if Alaska was the place where Jews were settled after the end of the Second World War? You go read the Yiddish Policeman's Union, and it will try to answer that question. How will it be to be a human in that situation? You go and read Pavan, and it will answer the question like, how might it be to be human if in a place where the Catholic Church controls scientific developments from the 16th century on, because there was no Reformation. It will try to look at that. It will also look at like, how would the world be in that situation? It's stuff that science fiction looks at as well, but it's also about like, how would it be to be in that place and time? Now, what does fantasy do as a different genre there? And fantasy also explores what it would be to be human, what the human condition is. But fantasy goes like, let's look at how it would be as a human, in what it means to be human in situations that right now are not possible at all. It's like, what would it be to be in, human? And human is like a wide definition, because it also asks, like, what would it be to be an elf or whatever. Like, this is the point that I'm trying to make. It's like, it still looks at, like, what's the human condition in places that, from where we are right now, are not achievable by technology that we understand, and science that we know right now. Which is why we look sometimes back, like, what would it be if dragons were real? And we're like, that's not a scientific question, so it's not science fiction. What would it be like to be, I don't know, a dwarf? It's not a it's not a scientific question, but it still tries to answer that same, goes towards the same thing, which is like, what would it be like to be that person? What does it mean? What can we take out of that? How can that help? And then you can take that specific way, that specific lens of looking at the human condition, to make all kinds of points, like use that deliberate, like, estrangement from reality, use that specific weird point of, like, deliberately not being real, and sort of like the thing that we buy in, which Philip Chase mentions, the suspension of belief, is exactly what, through that deliberate estrangement from reality, what points can I make that might be important about our world right now that we just tend to overlook because we're too used to them? How can we use the unfamiliarity to make points about the familiar? But that's like a corollary to what I've just said. So my definition, because I come from that philosophical background, is fantasy fiction is fiction. That means, like, made up. And it is looking at what it means to be human in places that are, from where we're standing right now, not achievable, not actual possibilities through the advancement of technology and science. Those places that are deliberately not real and not possible, not feasible, in a way. That's what fantasy is all about. So there's my definition. Let me hear your definitions, and let's have us a bit of a discussion. Thanks for watching, and cheers.